Rise up!
This is the Rise Up See Red podcast, all about the Arizona Cardinals and the NFL, featuring insider and outsider perspectives. Enjoy the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Now here are your hosts, Jess Root and Seth Cox.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans, and welcome to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast. I am your host, Jess Root from CardsWire.com, the Arizona Cardinals site from the USA Today NFL Wire. This is episode 362. It is installment number 4 out of 6 of our 2022 Cardinals opponent preview shows, and it is part 1 of our NFC South preview, as the Cardinals will play all 4 teams in the NFC South this coming season. The first 2 teams on their schedule are the Carolina Panthers, who they play in Week 4, and then the New Orleans Saints in Week 7, Thursday Night Football, the first game that DeAndre Hopkins will be back. And so in this edition of the show, we have writers, contributors, or managing editors from each of the opponent teams from our NFL Wire sites, from Panthers Wire and from Saints Wire. Those interviews are coming up now. In this segment of the Rise Up See Red podcast of SRF Cardinals Talk on the Web, the next opponent preview that we have up is the Carolina Panthers, whom the Cardinals face again. And to help us get to know that team, the team that the Cardinals can just not manage to beat, is Natalie Miller, one of the contributors on DraftWire.com and soon-to-be contributor on our Panthers Wire site, PanthersWire.com, which covers the Carolina Panthers. Natalie, nice to meet you. You're fairly new to the network, so it's good to get to know you a little bit. I've been doing the opponent preview series for this is the 3rd year in a row leading up to this. We hit the dead part of the offseason, and I had Tim Weaver on for the last two off seasons, and then I got to have him on today, recording about the Seahawks this time. But how are you? Welcome to the network, and I'm glad to have you on the show.
I'm glad to be here, Jess. Yeah, it's good to get to know you. It's good to get discussing all the draft wire stuff, and I'm excited to talk about Panthers stuff now that I'm transitioning over the other side. I'm excited for this discussion. I love facing the Cardinals. So,
of course, the Panthers like facing the Cardinals because it doesn't matter what the situation is. The Panthers win. I think it was 2013, maybe 2012 or 2013. I think it was 2013 when it was the game where Darrell Washington came off his suspension. We had Darrell Washington, Carlos Dansby at linebacker. They sacked Cam Newton like 6 times in that game, and I think it was 2013. And since then, has been a big goose egg for the Cardinals against the Panthers. Doesn't matter whether it's Cam Newton, Kyle Allen, or Teddy Bridgewater starting. They can't manage to do it. Now, none of those quarterbacks are with the Panthers, but let's look back at the last season. Matt Rule, what obviously last year was, you guys did not see the improvement that you wished to have had. You moved on from Teddy Bridgewater, bring on Sam Darnold, but take us back through the season. What were there any positives, and what were the things that went wrong in the 2021 season?
The first month of the season was great. You thought it was born anew. You thought you had a new franchise quarterback with Sam Darnold. We were 4-1 at one point before we faced a good Cowboys team, and ever since then we just fell apart. And a lot of that had to do with the play of Sam Darnold, but there was also a mixture of poor coaching and poor offensive line play. And they hope to have corrected that this offseason, but I'm not so sure.
So take us through. So it seems puzzling what they've done the last couple of years. So they went from having Cam Newton, they cut Cam Newton. They had to cut ties for whatever reason. They bring in Teddy Bridgewater. Then they get rid of Teddy Bridgewater. They bring in Sam Darnold. And then they had P.J. Walker. They brought Cam Newton back. And then this offseason, they're rolling with Sam Darnold, draft Matt Corral. Is there any rhyme or reason of what they're doing at quarterback? Do you think that before the season begins that they will have moved on from one of these guys and gone after, say, Jimmy Garoppolo, Baker Mayfield, as of right now recording. So by the time this publishes, maybe something will have happened. But do you see them making another move still at quarterback?
Yeah, I do think they are actively working towards Baker Mayfield, and then the fallback plan is Jimmy Garoppolo. Because if you don't get either of those two players, what are you really doing? Matt Rule is going to go into a lame duck season with Sam Darnold again. Like, you're going to trot him out and say, "Yeah, we're going to go have a winning season with this quarterback who failed last year just because we have an improved offensive line." I don't think Matt Rule want to risk his career on Sam Darnold, even though maybe he should be forced to, because he was the one that sort of pushed that trade.
So a couple years in, what is the feeling about Matt Rule as head coach?
It's not good in the community that I've seen on Twitter, on forums. I don't meet very many Matt Rule defenders. You take a look at what he took over for, and like you said, it was Cam Newton at the time, and then they cut ties with him, and that's understandable, but it's just been a Russian roulette at non-franchise quarterbacks that you're taking big swings and misses for, and you're not really seeing any type of improvement anywhere else along the team. I mean, he drafted well enough on the defensive side of the ball, so you have good starters and a bright future, but if you can't figure out the quarterback position and you can't outcoach the other team, there isn't really much hope going forward, you know?
All right, so coming up next on the Rise Up C Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web, let's talk about the offseason. Losses and additions that they made, whether it's in free agency or the draft. That's coming up next on Rise Up C Red. We're back on the Rise Up C Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Still talking to Natalie Miller from Draft Wire and soon to be Panthers Wire contributor on our USA Today NFL Wire network. Natalie, tell us about the changes in terms of losses. So they moved on. They didn't move on from Sam Darnold, but did they lose in free agency? Whom did they trade? Who did they just let go?
Yeah, they lost some really good defensive starters. They lost Stephon Gilmore, who barely even felt like he was a Panther. And then they lost Jermaine Carter, who was an excellent linebacker for us. And the most notable is our 12-plus sack pass rusher, Hassan Reddick. Like, we couldn't get a deal done with him because we had other contracts elsewhere, but you can't overstate the loss of one of the best pass rushers in the league. And I think you're going to feel that this season when you don't have somebody opposite Brian Burns.
How did you guys feel about, because obviously the Cardinals were very familiar with Hassan Reddick, and his story is kind of well documented here as a big draft miss. He signed the 1-year deal last year. Would you feel that, obviously, he exceeded expectations? I know we saw bunches of sack early on. He did go through a stretch where the production tailed off. Do you feel that moving forward, he can be a double-digit sack guy for the foreseeable future?
Oh yeah, definitely. He's a very good pass rusher. He was the best pass rusher on our team, and I think wherever he landed with the Eagles, right?
Correct.
He shouldn't have much of a problem in their 4-3 front. That is a really good 4-3 front.
I was always it was interesting because he showed that he could do it all, and I was very intrigued to see him go to Carolina and to play. Did he line up? So since I didn't see them a lot, he was listed as a linebacker at some point, but did he play on base end, or did he play? Obviously, he was at the edge for nickel, but in base, was he on the edge as in 4-3?
Yeah, he was on the edge most of the time. Like, there was some hybrid stuff that he did because Phil Snow's defense is pretty hybrid-y.
Like most defenses now are.
Yeah, he was mostly on the edge opposite Brian Burns, yeah.
Interesting, because there's one thing. So if you know the story of Hassan Reddick at all, when he was drafted out of Temple, like, he played defense. He was an edge guy. He was a pass rusher at Temple. And pretty much universally, people believed that he would be a very good off-the-ball linebacker, and that the Cardinals drafted him to do that. You know, at 6'1", 235, you're not built to play edge full-time. And he struggled. He had no linebacker instincts at all. He worked really hard, but was a late to pretty much all the plays. Struggled with coverages when he would, and he played in different schemes. So he went from James Betcher's scheme in 2017 to Steve Wilkes in 2018. And then 2019, he got into Vance Joseph, and they finally, at the end of that season, decided that full-time he would go to the edge. But he played some edge in his rookie season after Marcus Golden got hurt, and he played edge at the end of 2019 with very little production in terms of pass rushing. And so there was, in 2020, when Chandler Jones got hurt, now he was playing in a reserve role. So he would come in for certain downs and had some success, and then exploded at the end of the year where he had end up with the 12.5 sacks, the 5-sack game against the Giants. But there was a 5-game stretch where he didn't get any sacks, and so the Cardinals were hesitant about trying to bring him back. I think they wanted to bring him back something a little. I think the deal that they gave Marcus Golden is what they offered Hassan, and he wasn't real thrilled about that and ended up going to Carolina, being productive. But it's, for me, the narrative about him is also very different, because they say the Cardinals messed him up, when I think every team would have done the same thing. They would have tried him at the off the ball spot because of his size. His frame is just not. Very, very, very few people have been able to do what he's done from the edge, and it's because he has elite get off speed. It was a combination of opportunity and luck that Chandler Jones got hurt, that he was able to have the 2020 that he had, and then he followed up with another very good season with the Panthers, and now he's off to Philadelphia, where the Cardinals will face him again this year, which is going to be all sorts of fun. So anybody else of note and impact losses in free agency? So you mentioned Reddick, you mentioned Gilmore. Gilmore is an interesting one because, but is there anyone else of note that will impact, their absence will impact what happened?
Yeah, we also lost AJ Boya and Daquan Jones. They weren't like superstars or anything, but they were definitely noticeably good. I thought AJ Boya performed really well towards the end of the year. I thought he was one of our better corners. Corner depth isn't really that much of a problem for us, but we don't have a ton of veterans. Like Dante Jackson's probably 26 years old, and he's our most veteran leader in the cornerback room. I think that presence can't be understated, losing that.
Moving into, who are the key additions in free agency that should impact, good or bad, of what the Panthers do this coming season? How have they replaced some of the players that they lost?
The entirety of the offensive line. I think they did a really good job addressing the offensive line this offseason. They were able to draft, obviously, Ike Mekwanu. They were able to bring in Austin Corbett and Bradley Bozeman, so the interior is solid. So you're going to have, I think this is the first time that I've ever gone into the offseason. I'm like, okay, we're okay at the offensive line. We're not going to get punished. And I think that's key in maybe seeing if Sam Darnold has something, because the whole excuse his entire career has been he hasn't had an offensive line, and now he does. If they roll with Sam Darnold, I think that will definitely help.
And anyone else in free agency? Did they add anyone else on defense that will change how things look this year?
Yeah, they added Corey Littleton and Matt Ioannidis. Ioannidis is going to take Morgan Fox's spot on that defensive line, and I think Littleton will probably start with Frankie Louvu and Shaq Thompson in a rotation, which I think is pretty key because they like to have those speedy linebackers in a rotation and keep them fresh, which is one of the few teams that I know of that rotates their linebackers like that. But yeah, it is a pretty big deal that they were able to get Ioannidis too, and Damian Wilson as well that they added for the linebacker spot.
The big thing about the draft is everyone thought that, and I'll be one of them, that felt that they were going to take a quarterback that it was probably going to be in the first round, that they were going to go with Malik Willis out of Liberty. And then they passed on the quarterback in the first round, and everyone passed on Willis in the first round and the second round. And then finally in the third round, that Matt Corral. is the next quarterback off the board. I think pretty much that was a surprise for everyone following the draft. And Kenny Pickett being the only one taken in the first round by the Steelers, which wasn't much of a surprise at all. But Ekwonu, nice selection in the first. Did the Panthers simply not believe? I'm guessing that finally the league believed this is not a good quarterback class. What's the thought on Corral's prospects in the future?
Yeah, I think they liked Corral better than his draft position. I think of all the quarterbacks that they were considering, it was between Corral and Pickett. He fits that Ben McAdoo offense. Ben McAdoo likes the quarterback with a quick release that is accurate. And I think of the quarterbacks in this class, Corral has the quickest release. He came out of a weird system where they ran RPO like 94% of the time. So I don't think he can come in and start right away. There's a gap that he has to close to be able to do it. But as far as developmental talent goes, it's there. Like, you can develop him. And as a third round pick, you can't really say that every year about a quarterback. Like, oh, in 2 years, we're going to be looking at Matt Corral as a potential starter. I don't think you do that in most drafts, but I think Matt Corral has that arm talent, that intelligence, that gritty, and that moxie to be able to compete and be a starter in the league.
And then you look at the rest of the draft class. You've got Ekwonu in the first round. You've got Matt Corral in the third. If you look at the guys that they drafted after that on day 3, Brandon Smith, Amari Barno, Cade Mays, Kalen Barnes, do you see any of those guys on day 3 having any sort of significant role this coming season?
Yeah, I think Brandon Smith will right away. I think he's, like I said, they rotate those linebackers and they like the really athletic, speedy ones. And I think Brandon Smith can not only play a little bit of that linebacker role, but he might slide into that sort of hybrid role that Chin plays. Like, he'll be able to play in a lot of different spots for the Phil Snow defense. And I think Amari Barno, I thought he dropped in the draft. I think he can definitely get some snaps in off the edge because there's kind of an open competition at that opposite edge spot of Brian Burns.
All right. Coming next on the Rise Up Secret podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Let's look at the outlook for the 2022 season. That's coming next on Rise Up Red. We're back on the Rise Up Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web, and we will focus this last segment on the coming 2022 season. What are the expectations for this team? What's a best case scenario? And I know I just saw on an email, it's nothing we can write about on the USA Today because it doesn't come from the Tipico Sportsbook, but that Matt Rule is the most likely, is the favorite to be the first head coach fired during the season. Not exactly a good look. Again, that's not what you want looking into the season, but how do you see kind of the best case, worst case scenario for this team being in 2022?
I mean, best case scenario is you figure out Sam Darnold and he comes alive and you don't have to trade assets to go get a quarterback, and he figures out his NFL career, and Ike Ekwonu comes in and starts right away, and he's a franchise left tackle, and your offensive line gets figured out because we have a good defense. So that's nothing's going to hinder on that. It's going to be all on this offensive line and Sam Darnold. And if they can turn things around and they're able to compete, it's a weak NFC. So the only competition you face in the division at the top is the Buccaneers. So you can probably sneak in as a wild card team in the best case scenario. But as far as the worst case scenario, I mean, you can bottom out. You can face all the same issues that you had last year. You didn't solve the quarterback position. You didn't address it. You didn't trade for it. You forced Matt Corral out there. He looks bad. You win 3 games. Matt Rule's fired. You're looking for a new head coach and a new quarterback next year.
Oh. Now, the Cardinals and the Panthers play in Week 4. This is going to be one of the things that we're going to see. The Panthers have had 5 wins each of the last 3 seasons. They haven't had a winning season since 2017, and that basically marked the end of that decline is what ended Ron Rivera's stay in Carolina. But the Cardinals cannot seem to beat them. It's been, I think it was 2013 was the last time that the Cardinals defeated the Panthers, and let me take a look and see if it was that or 2012. And yeah, so the last time was 2013, a 22-6 win by the Cardinals. That's when they really had the Cam Newton struggled. He was intercepted 3 times and sacked 7 times in that game, yet still threw over 300 yards in that game. The Cardinals haven't beat the Panthers since then. Now, the Panthers will face the Cardinals without DeAndre Hopkins. That will be game 4 of the season of his 6-game suspension. How do you see, I'm not asking for a prediction, how do you see the Panthers and their season compared to how you view the Cardinals and their expectations from the outside? Because the Cardinals are, I think how people view the Cardinals this year outside of our world here in the Phoenix area is very varied. Some think that they're just going to be more like what they were late in the season, and some think that if they get it together, they could be a surprise team. What do you see in a Cardinals team compared to how you see the Panthers team this coming season?
I think they're kind of similar in that the way each of the years has started out pretty good, and then you end up collapsing due to a lack of adjustment. So from an outside perspective of Arizona, you have to wonder if that collapse from last season will carry over into this season, or will it be more of a sustainable success where they start off hot, and can they sustain that throughout the season? I think the Cardinals are a good team. I think they have a good quarterback. I think they have good weapons. I think they have an underrated defense. I think they can really push for that division. I think they're a good team. I don't think Carolina is necessarily viewed the same way.
Right. The way I see the Cardinals is the NFC in general. I see as the 4 division winners from last year are the definite favorites to win their divisions again, with the Rams, the Packers, the Cowboys, and the Buccaneers. And that outside of them, and that there are a handful of teams that are, like right now, look like that are going to battle for those 3 wildcard spots. I think of the Cardinals, based on last year, I think they're the best of those teams, as they were on the verge of, they almost won the division with the collapse last year. They got the Cardinals, got the Eagles, got the Vikings, the Saints, and then the 49ers, although I don't believe much in the 49ers until I see Trey Lance do anything. And I think that below that, teams like the Panthers are the ones who would have to have everything go perfectly for them to kind of surprise and get up into that realm. Who do you think will be your surprise players for this coming season?
I think Ian Thomas or Dante Foreman that we signed this offseason is going to be a surprise, because I think they want to spell Christian McCaffrey a lot more than they've been doing and keeping him healthy. So it wouldn't shock me if Dante on multiple games out carries Christian. And from what we saw last year, he's a pretty power back that can carry the load for the team. So if they want an identity where they're going to pound the rock, which I think they do, Dante Foreman could have a pretty big year.
Excellent. That is Natalie Miller. I appreciate the time. That'll kind of wrap up this edition or this segment of our opponent previews with the Panthers. Natalie, other than your spot, obviously you find your content on Draft Wire. How can my listeners interact with you on social media or wherever else? As coming soon, Panthers Wire will have Natalie's work as well.
Yeah, you can find me over on Twitter. It's @Nat_NFL Draft.
Excellent. Natalie, thank you for taking the time this afternoon. Appreciate it as always. And that will wrap up this segment of the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. Thanks so much. Coming up next on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web, we move on to the New Orleans Saints. Our next opponent preview is next on Rise Up See Red. Next up on the Rise Up See Red podcast, opponent previews for the 2022 season. We've got the Week 7 matchup against the New Orleans Saints, the first game that the Cardinals have with DeAndre Hopkins back in the lineup, and on a Thursday night at home. And to help us get ready for that game, to preview that matchup, we've got John Sigler, the managing editor from SaintsWire.com, from our USA Today NFL Wire, which is one of the sister sites of like Cards Wire, like what I run. John, welcome to the show. Glad to have you. I'm if I'm recalling, this is probably the first time we've spoken, right? Because the Cardinals and Saints, I can't recall if they played recently.
Yeah, it's been a while. I think it was the 2019 season, I believe. It was Kyler Murray's first year.
Okay.
I remember they came to the Superdome. It was Cliff Kingsbury. It was his first interaction with the Saints media, I recall.
Okay, and that was my first year doing the preview podcast in the offseason was that next offseason, so leading into 2020, so that would make sense.
Yeah. As I recall, the Saints gave the Cards some trouble. It's very funny, from the Saints' perspective. Something that their defense has always struggled with has been mobile quarterbacks. And if you go back and look, Kyler Murray had one of his worst rushing games ever against the Saints. Somehow they picked that 1 week to defend the mobile QB very well. I want to say he ran like 6 times for maybe 18 yards, well beneath his per game average. And it ended up with the Saints winning by a couple of scores, as I recall, and they had a good day, good game plan. For some reason, they just cannot replicate that against anyone else.
Now
Jalen Hurts.
I remember that now.
Hurts,
that was the game that Murray actually got pulled at the end of the game because it was just going that badly. The Chase Edmonds was starting. He ran like 7 times for 8 yards, and that was after he had like 126 yard, 3 touchdown game against the Giants. He banged up his hamstring that game, and the Cardinals could do nothing right that game at all. That was the 2019 year when, they had just won, that it snapped their 3-game winning streak. They had won 3 in a row. They started 3-1. They won 3 in a row, and then they went into New Orleans and struggled. So yeah. Then Taysom Hill threw a touchdown pass. Oh, yeah. Awesome. Drew Brees.
Fun memory.
Yeah, Drew Brees went for 373 and 3 scores. Big game for him. So yeah, let's talk about last season. The Cardinals and Saints did not meet last season, and last season was the first post Drew Brees year. They finished, what was it, 9-8, correct?
Yeah, 9-8. They finished the season with a winning record. They were 1 game out of the playoffs. They needed the 49ers to come through at the very end of the year and against the Rams, and it just didn't materialize. Things didn't break their way. So if things had gone a little differently, Saints would have been in the mix, and that's how they're looking at it this year. Is, hey, we had a lot of injuries, had a lot of COVID issues late down the stretch. We're going to reload and make a push here. So last season was really tough for the Saints on that front. I hate to say that, it's just the injuries or the penalties or whatever, because those things can't be helped. But the Saints, they had 4 different starting quarterbacks over the course of the season. They had I hate this stat so badly. Let me make sure I get it right here. We had 4 different kickers attempt a field goal at some point over the course of the season. It was awful. Jameis Winston went down with an injury early on, and things just really fell apart without him. It didn't help that Taysom Hill was injured at the same time. And so options 1 and 2 are off the board. So then you have Trevor Siemian coming in, trying to right the ship, and it's not going well. You're without Michael Thomas for the entire season. You're without your Pro Bowl kicker and Wilt Lutz. And so those are, 3 of maybe the 5 most important players on the team missed most of the year. We got 6 games out of Jameis Winston before he went down, and it was a mess. So hopefully those guys get healthy. Hopefully they can shake back, and hopefully Dennis Allen's first year with the Saints goes better than his first year with the Raiders did way back when.
Oh, geez, yeah. So if we look, the 9-8 year, they just missed the playoffs. Did that meet sort of what the expectations or hopes for last season? Because after losing Drew Brees to retirement, obviously is going to be a cultural shift in terms of quarterbacking. Did they, obviously there were higher hopes, but for reasonable expectations, did they meet what was hoped out of that team last year?
Not necessarily. They were still saying like, hey, we're expecting to win double-digit games. We're expecting to win the division. And we're expecting to remain in the playoffs. The Saints won the NFC South 4 years in a row. That's the first time any team had ever done that in division history going into last season. Sean Payton was still the head coach, and he still had high expectations for everybody, and things just didn't break their way. They really struggled with a lot of adversity, struggled to overcome it. So we're really hoping that things will go a bit differently this time around. And hope that the additions and the adjustments they made in the offseason are going to play out the way we're hoping.
The quarterback position. Interesting thing is that outside of New Orleans, I would have to say that the adoration that Sean Payton had for Taysom Hill was interesting. Now, in terms of Taysom Hill as a quarterback, what did you think of him as a starting quarterback rather than a offensive weapon? Is, I guess, the best way to kind of describe him.
I would say that, and I do not mean this disrespectfully, but I would say Taysom, he's probably in the top 40. He's someone that a lot of teams would probably be okay having as their number 2. He's up there with like I'm trying to think of a comparison that's not insulting, but like the name that comes to mind is Blaine Gabbert with the Bucks.
Yeah.
And God will never
he was awful.
But
he was awful to start his career, but he's had a very long career now.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I think Taysom could be. He looked like to his credit, he put in a lot of work for a very long time to kind of refine his craft, work on his technique, dropping back. That's the thing that illustrates the work he put in more than anything. If you go back and look at just some of his dropbacks in the preseason from his first year with the Saints, it was the second year of the NFL. He started out with the Packers. If you go back and look at that preseason in, I think it was 2018, and can compare his dropbacks from then to what he was doing in the Falcons game, the season finale last year, it's a world of difference. Like he's moving so much more efficiently, and he is he's surveying the field. You can see him going through his reads and everything. That was not the case before. He was a one read and take off running QB in the past, and he put in a lot of work to get to that stage. Now that is not good enough to hang in the NFL. It's not good enough to start in the NFL. But Sean Payton recognized the work that Taysom Hill put in to get to that stage, and he gave him the opportunity to see how far it could take him. We were in training camp last year, and he and Jameis Winston were splitting first team snaps every single day, where the Saints were giving him every opportunity to make the case to take that job. Now he did not do that in the end. Jameis Winston did, and I think that if Taysom had been healthy at the time of Jameis's injury, he probably would have been the starter. But that was just a few weeks after he took a nasty concussion at Washington, and he missed like the next month because of that. And he still has a 45-minute gap in his memory from that concussion in week 5 of it was awful. And so it really sucks for him. Like it hurts to see that, because you see someone who has spent 3 or 4 years preparing for this opportunity, and then it's taken away from him. Now, as for where we are now, Taysom is he's moved to tight end now under Dennis Allen. Allen has said that Taysom's not going to be in the QB room anymore. He's in the tight ends room now. He's getting coached by Dan Roushar, the tight ends coach. That is his focus, which has not been the case before. In the past, Taysom's daily schedule was crazy, where he would have the morning workout, and then he would go to the QB's room for a few minutes, and then he would go to the running backs room, look, check out the blocking assignments, stop at the tight ends room, do some receiving drills later on. He was all, and then at the end of all that, the main reason he's even getting active for games is because he's a monster on special teams. And so his attention was split 5 or 6 different ways. And so it took a while for him to really focus, or it took a while for the Saints to direct his focus to one position. Last year it was quarterback. This year it's tight end. And that's really his path to remaining on the team now that Sean Payton isn't around. Because, in all honesty, Sean Payton was Taysom Hill's biggest cheerleader, or his biggest supporter, his biggest advocate in New Orleans. And now that Sean Payton isn't around, the Saints have Taysom Hill on this contract that's paying him like one of the 10 or 12 top tight ends in pro football. And now Taysom Hill has to go out there and earn it. So he's still recovering from some injuries right now. Last season, I mentioned the concussion. He also had a mallet finger in his throwing hand. That's where that's where you tear a tendon at the end of your middle finger. So you can't completely close it when you grasp a football. He also had a Lisfranc injury in one foot. He had plantar fascia in the other foot. The guy went through a lot last season, and so he's still recovering from those injuries, but he's expected to be ready for training camp. And when they do, I'll be looking to see if he's wearing a red no contact jersey or not, but it sounds like he's going to be playing tight end.
As we look at Jameis Winston's season, his first year with the team, would you say that he proved, like, obviously they re-signed him. Does he look like he could be the successor to Drew Brees, more than just a gap, but to be a guy who could then perhaps finish his career with the Saints? Went 5-2 as a starter, 14 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. That first game, like, he was more efficient than we've seen Winston be in basically his whole career.
Yeah, he has a shot. He has an opportunity to be that guy. Whether it'll materialize, we have to wait and see here. Winston is also still recovering from his knee injury right now. It has been getting better week by week, month by month. But he had his ACL fully torn, partially tore the MCL as well. So it's been kind of a complicated recovery for him. But he's working his way back. He's getting a lot of looks in practice, and that in his timetable has him getting the green light in time for training camp. So we'll see if that comes to pass. I certainly hope so, because just like Taysom, Jameis Winston has put in a lot of work to get this opportunity. He spent so much time last offseason gathering teammates for throwing sessions all over the country. And he's been, we saw some of the fruits of that labor last year. Like he said, it was only 7 games, but he threw 14 touchdowns against only 3 interceptions. So he really improved in protecting the football and making better decisions. He was still kind of inconsistent, and I don't think Sean Payton really trusted him until, unfortunately, just before he got hurt. He was only throwing, let's see here, 161 pass attempts over 7 games. That is not many. That's 23 passes a game. So it's hardly the workload we saw with Drew Brees, who averaged 38 to 40 pass attempts per game, depending on the year, over the decades with Sean Payton. So Winston never really earned Sean Payton's trust, I think, or he wasn't given it. So there's so much projection going on with him now. With that said, I'm an optimist. I want to believe that Jameis is going to figure some things out, that he can remain efficient on a heavier workload. And something that we need to remember here is that he didn't have Michael Thomas last year. He still has not thrown a pass to Michael Thomas at this stage in his Saints career. And we're talking about someone who was an offensive player of the year, someone who's is up there, right along with DeAndre Hopkins in the conversation as the best receiver in football. And so you hope that Winston gets healthy, that Thomas gets healthy, that the upgrades he made in the receiving room with signing Jarvis Landry, drafting Chris Olave, you hope that all of that can kind of come together and set up the offense for success, even though Sean Payton isn't at the controls anymore.
Coming up next on the Rise Up See Red podcast, best of Cardinals talk on the web. Let's move to the offseason. Who were the players that the Saints lost that they have to replace? Who did they add? And what did their draft class look like? That's what coming up next on Rise Up See Red. We're back on the Rise Up See Red podcast, best of Cardinals talk on the web. Let's move to the free agent period. Who are the players of note? Obviously, they changed coaches, so that's the biggest change. Sean Payton retires. Dennis Allen is the new head coach. But who are the players that have moved on that will have the biggest, that are going to have the biggest impact negatively with their departure?
Yeah, so the Saints lost two big free agents this spring, that being free safety Marcus Williams and left tackle Teron Armstead. Both of those guys are in the conversation to be top 5 players at their position in the contracts they received. Williams went to Baltimore, Armstead went to Miami. It reflects that. These are two elite players, and the Saints are going to be taking some steps back without them. Now, there is reason for optimism here, in that Armstead did not lead the Saints in snaps played at left tackle last season. He missed a lot of time with injuries. His backup, James Hurst, is projected to start this year over first-round draft pick Trevor Penning. And Hurst got more time at left tackle than Armstead did. You know, that's just the facts. And he held his own, played very well there. And I expect him to kind of hold down that starting job for this next season. On the defensive side, we lost Marcus Williams at free safety. They brought in a couple free agents there. They brought in Marcus May, the same day that that Williams signed with Baltimore, incidentally, and he should be a good player for the Saints. He was actually drafted ahead of Marcus Williams back in 2017 by the Jets. But the bigger name here is Tyrann Mathieu. And what's interesting to me is that Marcus Williams has very rare range in the NFL. He allowed the Saints to play a lot of cover one, a lot of single high. And he just because he was able to cover so much ground, they could do things like trust Marshawn Lattimore to hold down one side of the field and then shade Marcus Williams over the number 2 corner, whoever that may be any given week. And that worked really well for them. They can't do that here now. And this is not a knock on Marcus May or Tyrann Mathieu, but neither of those guys are the athlete that Marcus Williams is. And the Saints are going to have to adjust to reflect that. And that's really discouraging. You know, that was one negative I wrote about early on in this offseason is the Saints hired Dennis Allen specifically because he was going to maintain continuity on the defensive side of the ball. His defense has been the strength of the team for the last 2 or 3 years, even 4 years, potentially, if you really want to get into the weeds on it. And the first thing that happens is he loses his free safety, and then his strong safety, Malcolm Jenkins, retires a few months later. And those are 2 of your top 3 players in snaps played last season. So that's a lot of continuity walking out the door. How do you solve that? Well, you solve it by signing some pretty high profile free agents. And hopefully May and Mathieu can get on the same page pretty quickly, keep the defense stout. And it's just one of these many things that you hope breaks the right way for the Saints to have a good year.
The addition of Jarvis Landry and the return of Michael Thomas, what does that do for the passing game? We'll get to the addition of Chris Olave as well, but just the presence of Landry in that receiving room, what will that do, especially now that it gives them an actual legitimate receiving threat outside of Alvin Kamara?
Oh, it is huge. It's huge. The Saints, their receiving core was probably it was by far their weakest unit last season. Let's just be frank here. Again, I'm not saying this to be insulting, but Jameis Winston at one point threw a touchdown pass to a lacrosse player. Chris Hogan, former Patriots receiver, dropped. He left his semi-pro lacrosse team midway through their season to come play for the Saints, and ended up catching a TD from Winston at one point. And that really shows you how dire straits the receiving core was in. You know, without Thomas, they were relying on a bunch of young players without a lot of skins on the wall to kind of hold it down, and they really struggled. Marquez Callaway had a good year for the Saints. He had almost 700 receiving yards, but he was thrown at 84 times, only caught 46 passes. Deontay Hardy was in the mix there. He finally broke out as a receiver, but he only totaled 570 yards and 36 catches. Traquan Smith missed time with injury. He only had 32 receptions. And so the Saints really struggled to find a receiver who could consistently make an impact week in and week out. Having Jarvis Landry back, not only does he give you that as someone who has been to 5 or 6 Pro Bowls by now, he brings a lot of veteran experience that the Saints didn't have. their most experienced players at receiver were Ty Montgomery and Kenny Stills and Chris Hogan. And none of those guys really had the playmaking ability to go along with that experience and, having been there before, which is just something that their younger teammates did not share. And so Landry, to me, he brings a lot of leadership qualities, and he's also a reliable target for Jameis Winston to work with. So to me, that was just as big of an addition as signing Tyrann Mathieu was on defense.
In the draft, they added, and for me, honestly, it was a little bit of a surprise. They move up to get Chris Olave. Very, very good receiver. I loved Olave coming out. And then they add Trevor Penning. And that's actually when Seth and my co-host and I did our mock drafts, I actually pegged Penning to the Saints with that pick at number, what was it, 19? And I had them going with Treylon Burks at receiver. So I had the positions pegged. I had them going receiver, tackle. But now this receiving trio of Chris Olave, Michael Thomas, and Jarvis Landry, suddenly you've got not just, and you add that to Alvin Kamara as well, in the passing game for the running backs. Now, how do you feel about this receiving core? Now that you've added Landry, you get Thomas back, and you add the prospect of Olave.
Oh, I'm levitating. I'm on cloud nine here. It's exactly what I wanted. Chris Olave was my favorite receiver in the draft. He was either him or Jameson Williams. And the more I thought about it, the larger it loomed to me that Jameson Williams only went to Alabama because he couldn't take he couldn't get targets at Ohio State because of Chris Olave. So Olave was my number one receiver in the draft. I loved to see the Saints aggressively move up and get him. And I'm so excited to see what he's going to do. Beyond the athletic ability there, he's such a talented, even beyond like the raw talent. Like the dude has started 4 years at Ohio State. He's been starting games since his freshman year. He's been making an impact, leading the Buckeyes in receiving totals year after year. He is as accomplished as you could be coming out of college. And I think he's going to be a huge upgrade for the Saints. I'm so excited to see him get to work. I really think that he can be, a Chris Godwin plus for Jameis Winston, like he had in Tampa Bay, where he was working with Mike Evans and Godwin each week. I think Michael Thomas and Chris Olave can be that 1-2 punch for him. And then you have Jarvis Landry in the mix as well as your slot. So to me, that's a very exciting receiving core. 1, 2, 3 are all highly qualified for the roles that the Saints are designing for them. And then you have last year's receiving leaders, Callaway and Deontay Hardy. That's your 4 and your 5. And then you hope that someone like Traquan Smith can even make the team at that point, who was also started 6 games for you a year ago. So the Saints, they correctly identified receiver as one of their top offseason priorities. They acted aggressively to upgrade there. And they got a lot of players that I'm personally am very high on. So I'm very excited for that.
Trevor Penning, you mentioned that it doesn't look like he will start at left tackle. What do you think his role is in year one?
Yeah, so this is going to be, I feel pretty confident that this is going to be not a redshirt year for him, but he's going to be focused on getting coached up and developing. And to me, that kind of should be expected. Going from Northern Iowa to the NFL is about as big a jump as anyone could possibly make these days. And so even if Trevor Penning is he's an all-world athlete, he has a lot to work on with his technique. He was on the ground a lot for an IU, and he struggled to block on the move, which is something the Saints ask often of their tackles. So he really needs to harness that athleticism that has helped him get this far. And I think the Saints are probably the perfect spot for him to do that. They hired a new offensive line coach this year. That's Doug Marrone. He's a former NFL head coach for 2 different franchises. Yes. So that speaks pretty highly. Having him as your position coach, that's a pretty strong move. And then what I love most, though, this is the wrinkle that's really important to me for having Penning in New Orleans, is the assistant O-line coach is Zach Strief, who started like 11 years in the NFL. If you go and look at it, Penning, he's almost 6'7", he's over 300 pounds. Sharif has the exact same build as this guy. He doesn't have the agility and all the combine numbers and all this. But if you think about it, it's going to be really tough for a tall, an exceptionally tall offensive tackle to adjust to flexible NFL edge rushers. And Sharif was able to do that for a decade. I think there's a lot that he can teach Penning specifically to help with his development. So I would be surprised if he starts this year, just because the Saints have a good left tackle already in James Hurst, and because Penning does have so much work to do. But I think he's going to be very, very good for New Orleans for a very long time. I just don't expect it to happen right away. And I think that's probably the healthiest way to approach this. You don't want to throw someone into a situation before they're ready for it.
The other draft picks they get Tennessee cornerback Alontae Taylor, you get linebacker DeMarco Jackson, and you get Jordan Jackson, interior guy. Are any of those players expected to make an impact this coming season?
Yeah, I think they all have a shot. Alontae Taylor specifically, I this may be my hot take of the summer here, but I think he's going to start for the Saints at cornerback. I think that he's gunning for that job that was held down by Paulson Adebo last year. You got a 3rd round pick out of Stanford a year ago versus a 2nd round pick out of Tennessee this year. I think you put the two of those together and say, let the best man win. And Taylor, he nails everything the Saints look for, as far as the athletic prototype, as far as leadership qualities, as far as the production. He's a very talented young player. Dennis Allen was speaking last week after mini camps about how he's already impressed by how far along Taylor is relative to where they expected him to be a few months into the program. I think he's going to surprise some people. He certainly surprised me when the Saints drafted him, because I did not expect corner to be a need. I saw that the Saints they had a young corner starting last year. The only Paulson Adebo was the only Saints defender to start all 17 games last year as a rookie. That's very impressive to me. And I thought they would kind of lean on him a bit with their plans this year. They ended up bringing in some competition for him, and I wouldn't be shocked at all if Taylor wins that job. So he's the one I'm watching in training camp for sure.
Coming up next on the Rise Up See Red podcast, Best of Cardinals Talk on the Web. Let's return and talk to John Sigler about the outlook and expectations for the 2022 season. That's coming next on Rise Up See Red. We're back on the Rise Up See Red podcast, Best of Cardinals Talk on the Web. We're back with John Sigler from SaintsWire.com. Let's look ahead to the 2022 season with the return of Jameis Winston at some point. Hopefully he'll be ready to start the season with upgraded wide receiver, with some young tackle, with replacements in the secondary. What is sort of the expectation? What are reasonable expectations for the Saints this year? I will say that I think around the NFC that the favorites who are probably going to win the divisions, I think you look at the Bucs in the South, you look at the Rams in the West, you look at the Packers in the North, and you look at the Cowboys in the East as not locks, but definite favorites. Do you think the Saints can, in this season, compete with the Bucs for the division title? And what's your kind of your floor and ceiling for this team looking ahead?
Oh yeah, man. So I would be very surprised if the Saints are worse than they were last year, just given everything that went wrong, as we discussed with all the injuries and the COVID problems and everything. I would be very surprised if we have a repeat of that. And so with that in mind, I think the floor is 9-8. Like you've got to say, like, hey, we've brought back a lot of talent from last year. We've kept a lot of the same DNA for this team. We've addressed some of our biggest holes on the roster. Improvement should be the goal. And with that in mind, I'm personally predicting an 11-6 record. And I think that could be good enough to compete for the division title, especially once the Saints sweep the Bucs, as they've done every year since Tom Brady came to the division. The Saints have had Tampa Bay's number unlike any other team,
and Tom Brady's number in general as well.
Yeah. He hasn't beaten the Saints. Well, he's beaten them twice, I believe, in the regular season. That would be in 2013. He won on a play when Nate Solder held Junior Gillette and was uncalled on the game-winning touchdown. I'm still mad about that.
That doesn't sound bitter at all.
Not a bit. No. And then the Saints lost fair and square early in 2017 because they didn't know how to use Alvin Kamara yet. So I think he had one catch in that game. So anyway, they've had Dennis Allen's defense, and let's be specific. I mean, he's the one who Tom Brady ran over and cussed out at the end of his 9-0 shutout loss in primetime last season without Sean Payton in the game. Dennis Allen has had Tom Brady figured out. And when the Saints protect the football, the Bucs just can't compete with them. It hasn't happened. The only game the Bucs have won against the Saints since Tom Brady came to town was in the playoffs when Drew Brees had a meltdown and threw 3 interceptions in the last game of his Saints career. That's very painful for me personally to say. And all 3 of those interceptions resulted in either a touchdown for Tampa Bay or Tampa Bay running out the clock to win the game late in the fourth quarter. So whenever the Saints don't do that, if they can not throw interceptions, they can just smother the Tampa Bay offense and score enough points to win against that defense. So thankfully we've got Jameis Winston at quarterback and interceptions are not a concern. One would hope. So it's going to be a very high stakes battle. And personally, I'm really interested to see how it all shakes out. So to me, the Saints can compete with anybody anywhere. Their defense is that strong at all 3 levels. And the offense has made enough upgrades for me to think they're going to score more than like 18 points a game or whatever miserable number it was last year. So, man, I'm excited. I'm ready for July to breeze by in August, and let's just get on up here and get into week 1 with Atlanta, and we'll be playing the Cardinals before we know it.
Absolutely. And as you look at the Cardinals as a team, that you look in that week 7 Thursday night matchup, as Saints fan kind of look at that game, is that a game that they feel that it's a game that they should definitely win, toss up, or would it be considered a steal if they came out with a victory?
I think it's a toss up. I think that's going to be one of the more difficult games on their schedule. And I would expect Arizona to be favored in that game just because they bring more continuity here with having DeAndre Hopkins, with having Kyler Murray, having all these things figured out. They're going to be a tough out. And I'm really curious to see what the Saints look like at that point this season. Obviously, the biggest matchup will be DeAndre Hopkins against Marshawn Lattimore. They've only played one time before. That was in week 1, 2019, when Hopkins was with the Texans.
Yeah.
Pro Football Focus charted them with as running each other pretty often. Hopkins was thrown at 7 times when covered by Lattimore. He caught 4 passes for 51 yards and a TD, converted 2 first downs. I would feel pretty good about that if that's what we end up coming away with in this rematch. And with it being Hopkins' first game after the suspension, I think the Saints have a good shot. And if they can limit Hopkins, then to me that would go a long way towards what they can do to defend everyone else. So I know the Cardinals have Zach Ertz. He's going to be a problem. They've got some running backs. It's going to be a lot to figure out. But but at the end of the day, Lattimore has defended Hopkins well in the past. Dennis Allen has come up with a really good plan to neutralize Kyler Murray in the past. So if we can just go back to those wells and keep up the pressure, I think this is a winnable game for the Saints. But that's still far from certain.
All right, and that again, listeners, is John Sigler from SaintsWire.com. Aside from the site, John, is there anywhere Cardinals fans can follow you to interact with you? Are you on social media at all?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter. You can follow me at John_Sigler. That's Siglerr. I had to use 2 that somebody got to me first with the Sigler with 1 R, unfortunately. So, but you can keep up with me there. Follow along. Be sure you're following the Saints Wire as well. We'll have all of our content up there from me and our team of contributors here at Saints Wire. It's been an exciting all season so far, and we'll see where it takes us here in July.
All right, John, I really appreciate your time. And that wraps up this edition of the Rise Up C-Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. This has been episode 362, the 4th installment of our 6 Cardinals 2022 opponent preview shows, and also part 1 of the NFC South. In our next show, which will come early next week, we will have the final 2 opponents for the NFC South, and installment 6 will come later next week when we will focus on the 3 second-place games that the Cardinals have this coming season, when they face the Vikings, they face the Eagles, and they face the New England Patriots. So that's it for this edition of the Rise of C Red podcast. Thanks for listening. We'll be back again next week.
Thanks for listening to the latest edition of the Rise Up C Red podcast. Listen to previous episodes and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Audioboom, or many other podcast platforms so shows are delivered directly to your mobile device. Please give the show a 5-star rating and always support the sponsors who support the show. We'll be back soon for the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Rise up, Red Sea, be Red, Sea Red, and of course, Rise up, Sea Red.